So far we covered how to model or create geometry using primitives, generators, and deformers. Now we're going to dive into some traditional modeling techniques to model ourselves a little fishy friend for our crab to kind of populate this fishbowl here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and compartmentalize. I'm going to model this fish in a new project. So I'm going to click the plus sign to add a new project tab. I'm going to go and just save this project as, and just name this fishy. And I'll just write over the file that I already had there. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with a simple cube. And just like Michelangelo chiseled the David statue out of a giant block of marble, so will we create a fish from this simple cube. Now, when you start with a cube, this is kind of called box modeling. And you can kind of see why. You start out with a kind of boxy shape. And the main goal here is to create an organic fish form from this cube. Well, everything here is very sharp edge, doesn't look like a fish just yet, but what we're going to use to help create a more organic looking object is something called a subdivision surface, okay? So subdivision surface you can find in our generator menu here. I'm just going to go ahead and grab that subdivision surface. And remember, this is a generator object, so we need to feed objects into it and make an object a child of that subdivision surface, that generator object, for it to act upon that object. And you can see our subdivision surface, if we click on it, is basically subdividing our object 2 times. And if we go to display garage shading lines, you can see if I toggle this on and off by turning off this checkbox and making it into an X, there's our original edges. And then when we turn on our subdivision surface, it's basically subdividing our object 2 times. And you can see all those added subdivisions. And it's not only subdividing it, but it's also smoothing it out as well. So subdivision surfaces will help create a more organic looking smooth model off of just basic boxy shapes like our cube here, okay? Now, if we go to our cube, you can see that we only have one segment in X, Y, and Z. But let's just see what happens when I crank up the segments X. And you'll see as we add some segments in the X, this is creating more of a cylindrical type of shape, and it's sharpening the shape in the X. And if I go ahead and do the same thing in the Y, you can see the more subdivisions we add, the more segments we add, the sharper this object is and the less smooth it is. So when you add subdivisions, it's almost like tightening up the mesh. And you can see with segments of 9 in X, Y, and Z, we now have more of a rounded cube versus if we bring these back to 1, a smooth sphere, okay? So this is kind of the key in understanding how subdivision surfaces work. When you add more segments or edges, it's going to sharpen your object, okay? So let's just bring these segments back down to 1. So what I want to do next is I actually want to manipulate this object and create more polygons, extrude polygons out from this rounded cube shape to create a fish, all right? So if I go up here, you can see we have point, edge, and polygon mode, and if I click that and try to click the points on our object, you can see I can't access those points or edges or polygons on this cube. And why that is that our cube, our primitive objects, come in as parametric objects, which means that you have access to all these parameters of all these primitives, but not the point, edges, or polygons. To be able to model using this cube, we actually need to take this primitive shape and turn it into just a piece of geometry, a polygonal object. And to do that, we are going to select our cube, and we can either hit this button right here, which will make our object editable, or we can hit C. Now I'm just gonna go and hit C so I can remember that shortcut key. And once I do that, you can see that we no longer have those parameters. So we now have not a parametric object, but a polygonal piece of geometry. But what you'll see now is if I select this polygon mode, you can select a polygon and move it around. And we can start manipulating this piece of geometry. I can select an edge and move this in or out. And this is where you can start forming and shaping this cube and model it into a fish, okay? So let's go ahead. I'm going to go into my polygon mode. And you can notice on the side here, we have a dynamic palette that changes depending on what mode you're in. And it tries to give you all of the different types of options that you might need when you have that mode selected. So when I'm in polygon mode, you can see if I just hover over here, we have the bevel tool here, we have an extrude tool, the inset, which is inner extrude, bridge, all this type of settings here, which is really cool. And what I'm going to do is let's first go in our 4UP view by hitting F5, because it's always smart to, when you're modeling, to see how your object looks in all 4 views. So with this polygon selected, I want to extrude to the right to basically make the tail of the fish. And we can extrude a multitude of ways. We can go over to our side menu here and hit the extrude button and click and drag. And you can see that will extrude everything out. And you can see that as we extruded it out, we tightened up this side here because we added a subdivision. Let me just go Command and Control Z to undo that. And I can also, if I want to extrude, I can right click and choose the extrude tool this way, or I can hit the E key to just totally get out of my extrude tool and just go into my move tool. And with this axis selected, I can hold down the Command or Control key, and you'll see my cursor has 2 boxes. I can click and drag on this axis here, and I can extrude out in this direction. Okay, so awesome. We have this extruded polygon here. One way to easily turn on and off your subdivision surface, toggle it on and off, is to hit the Q key. So I'm going to hit Q, and you can see this is the result of our extrude. We just extruded this polygon face outwards. And if I hit Q again, it'll turn back on our subdivision surface. And now we can go and say, hit the T key to get our scale tool and scale down this polygon. I can hit the E key and move this in. And then what I'll do is, let's go ahead and I'll hit the Control Command key again and extrude out one more time. And now what I can do is hit the T key, and I can just scale up in the Y, okay, something like this, and I'll hit Command or Control key again and extrude out and hit the T key, and maybe I'll, shrink this down a little bit. And what I want to do now is basically like extrude out from both of these polygons. I'm just going to hold the Shift key down to add this polygon to my current selection. And what we could do to extrude both of these polygons outwards to create the little fins is, again, go to our extrude tool and click and drag. Or if I Command or Control Z to undo that, I can go to my scale tool and hit Command or Control key down and click and drag. And this will also extrude out both of those polygons as well. Now, if I hit the T key, basically what I want to do now is select both of these polygons, hit the T key for the scale tool, and scale these down to create the fins. But if I go and select both of these polygons, again holding the Shift key down to add to my polygon selection, and if I was to scale these down, we're actually scaling down to the shared axis center here, and that's not what we want. I just want to scale down each of these individual polygons just like this, but at the same time, okay? So to do that, I'm going to hold the Shift key down, select this polygon here, and what I want to do instead is I'm going to right click, and this is one way to bring up some of your modeling tools, and I'm going to go all the way down to normal scale. And when I go into and activate my normal scale tool and click and drag, you can see this is scaling down those polygons just like so. So we're scaling each polygon down, and now I can go ahead and hit the E key to get my move tool, maybe select this polygon, move it in, hit the T key, scale this down, and I can even grab these polygons here, scale this down, and I can even go and grab individual edges, like these 2 edges here, and scale this up, move this in, kind of do whatever I want here. Now let's just say I wanted to, make this area between the main body of the fish and the fin a little skinnier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this loop of edges here. So we can do this multiple ways. We can either bring up our modeling menu, and there's 2 of them. If you hit U, this will bring up all the shortcut keys that relate to modeling, selection, tools and stuff like that. And you can see loop selection is L. So if I want to bring up the loop selection, I'm going to hit L, and this will allow me to select that edge. Okay, so you can also, if I click out of that, I can hit the E key and just double click this edge, and this will also make a loop selection as well, as you can see in our 4-up views here. So now what I can do is I can hit the T key and scale this down. And make sure you pay attention to your 4-up views so you just see how much you're scaling this down. Definitely don't want to also scale down in just one direction and make this super skinny or anything like that. You can also scale down in maybe just the Y and kind of see what this is looking like. And I think this is much better. I think one thing I might want to do is have more control over, maybe I want this fin and go to model mode. What I can do is I'm just going to go and grab the doodle tool here, and this is just going to help me illustrate what I'm trying to accomplish here. And I just kind of maybe want to have this fin more like this. Okay, so a little bit thicker right around this area here. So I'm going to need to add a control cut. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead, delete that doodle object that I made there. I'm going to go back into my edge mode, select my cube. And what you're going to do is actually see the polygons that are actually making up our object before it gets subdivided. Again, if I hit the Q key, you can see where those outlines are coming from. And these will go away if I just hit the move tool or hit the E key. And if I go back to edge mode, what I can do is to make this area thicker, I'm going to make a cut, a loop cut, to add another loop edge that I can then control to make this fin a little bit thicker. So to do that, I'm going to bring up the other modeling shortcut menu, which is the M key. And this is going to bring up a totally different menu that relates to different modeling tools. Here you can see that T is the shortcut key for extrude. And if I wanted to make a loop cut, that key is L. So again, we're going to see this wireframe view here. And what we can do now is if I hover over my model, you can kind of see where that preview of the cut's going to be. So I'm just going to cut right here. And you can now see if I hit the E key, this new loop cut. So now I can go ahead and double click to select that edge loop, hit the T key to move this up, and maybe move this in. Now, another thing we can do instead of moving this selected loop edge in and out is we can actually slide this loop selection up and down the mesh. Now, that might not make a lot of sense right now, but let's bring up our slide tool. And we can find our slide tool by hitting the M key again to bring up our modeling function menu. And you'll see that slide is O. So I'm going to hit O. And now if I click and drag with the slide tool, you can see we're sliding this edge up and down this mesh, and we can have a lot more fine-tuned control over where that edge cut lives. So this is looking really nice. Again, it helps to kind of square up your model in all of your views. And one easy way to do that is to have your cursor over one of your views and hit the H key. And what this is going to do is maximize the framing of your object to fill up this view. So I'll hover over the front view, hit H, hover over the right view, hit H, and you can see exactly where that edge is and how this kind of, looks. So one thing that might be confusing is, we're seeing these subdivided edges here, and I'm just going to go ahead and maximize my perspective view here. I actually really don't like working in this mode where not only can you see the original edges of our cube that are rounded out here, you can see right there, but we're also seeing the extra subdivided edges coming from the subdivision surface. And what I like to do when I'm modeling is to only see the smoothed out original edges of our smoothed out object. So to see that, I'm going to go to my display menu and go to isoparms, and you'll see that that's going to get rid of those added subdivisions. So it's just a cleaner way to work. I really like working in this mode a lot better because I really don't need to see all those extra subdivisions. Another thing that you can also do is go to filter and go down to SDS cage, and this will actually allow you to see the original polygon object cage or outline as you're manipulating your object. So you can see exactly what happens with the original unsubdivided mesh as you're moving the smoothed out subdivided mesh, as you can see here. But again, I don't like having that SDS cage on, so I'm going to go to my filter menu and just deactivate that. Okay. So one thing I can do now is with that added cut there, I can hold the shift key down, select both of these edges here, and maybe thicken this out, move these edges, maybe scale these down a little bit. And this is looking pretty good. Another thing I can do is let's go to our polygon mode. Let's select this polygon, maybe shrink this down, move this in, maybe a little something like that. And maybe I grab both of these polygons here, and let's go ahead and let's get our normal scale tool. And that will be under our M modeling menu. And if you see, normal scale is that dash. So it's the top two items here. So normal rotate, normal scale. I'm just going to hit the dash key and click and drag. And you can see we're scaling those polygons down. So this is looking pretty good. I'm digging this. I think what I might want to do is select this edge. So I'll go to edge mode, double click that loop there, maybe scale this down a little bit. Maybe I'll double click and select this loop of edges too and adjust this as well. And then maybe we can go ahead and let's select all these polygons here. So I'm going to go to polygon mode, and to select all these polygons, I can do one of two things. I can hit the 0 key to bring up my rectangular selection, which is just right up here if you want to grab it manually. And I can click and grab all these polygons, or what I can do is grab my loop selection, and I'm just going to grab this first loop of polygons. And then what I'm going to do is fill in that selection. So it's almost like the fill tool in Photoshop where you can fill in the rest of your shape. So to bring that up, I'm going to bring the U key menu up again. And if you look for fill selection, that is F. So if I hit F, you can see if I hover over, it's going to select all the remaining polygons on this side of this loop selection. So to add to this original selection, I'm going to hold the shift key down, and I selected all those polygons, and now I can hit the T key and maybe bring up our 4-up view, and I can just make this a little skinnier so it's not such a chubby fish. And we can do whatever we want. Maybe we flatten out the head of it by grabbing the top polygon, moving it down. And one thing you don't want to do is moving polygons all willy-nilly like this, because I can be in this perspective view and just click and drag, and you can see how distorted our mesh is now. Okay, so I'm going to Command Z to undo that. You can see, depending on where we move this polygon, this almost looks more like a whale or something like that. So you can see kind of the beginnings of how you can start modeling out all types of shapes. Okay, now maybe once I'm looking at this, I want to scale down this fin altogether. So what I can do there is hit U and then L for loop selection, and then U and then F for fill, and select the rest of the tail. Hit the T key, adjust this. And one tool I really love to use is the smooth tool. It really helps to smooth everything out. Maybe your model is looking a little janky, a little bumpy or something like that. To smooth that out, that tool is actually called the iron tool. And we can bring that up with the M shortcut key menu. So M and G is the iron tool, and we can just kind of iron this out. You can see that that really removes all those little curves that we had there. But if we just iron this out just a touch, so this is where we were, and this is where we can kind of smooth things out. And I'm kind of liking that a little better. If you ever get confused as to where your functions are, like U or M, just remember that U is where all of your selection tools are. So your loop selection, path selection, fill selection, and then M is your modeling function. So if you want to, adjust your edges, like using the slide tool, that's under here as well. And again, you can at any time right click and also get a bunch of menu options as well, and also learn what those shortcut keys are. So multiple ways to try to learn and remember all of the multitude of shortcut keys that you can use to bring up, all of these modeling tools. But again, we only needed to get familiar with a few tools to model this fish, and I'm liking this fish so far. Okay, so we have our subdivision surface. Let's just say maybe this is a little too chunky. What we can do is we can up this subdivision editor, and this is going to actually add more subdivisions and smooth this out. And we can see this plain as day if we go to our wireframe display mode. And you can see if I up this editor, how it just doubles the amount of edges and subdivisions and in turn smooths this out even more. Now you might be wondering, why is there a subdivision editor and a renderer number here? Well, this number is what you see in your viewport, and this number is what you see, the amount of subdivisions you see when you render. So if I were to render this out, I'll just go to my render to picture viewer, you can see that what we have in our render is actually that chunky original version, because we're only rendering this with this subdivision number at 2. Okay, so you want to make sure if you're seeing a discrepancy in what your viewport sees as far as a smooth object and what's rendering out, it's probably because these two numbers don't match up. And you might be wondering, well, why are there two different numbers? That's kind of confusing. And for a beginner, sure, that's a little confusing, but the whole point of this is that you can make this subdivision editor to say 1, and what this does is the more subdivisions you have, and I've mentioned this before, the slower your viewport will run. So remember when we did the dynamic placement tool and we had all those small rocks? Now, if you had very highly subdivided rocks, like if you had a very dense mesh, the simulation would run slower than, say, if you went and used a remesher and removed some of those polygons to kind of speed up that simulation. So there are impacts to things like simulations and animation when you have a very dense mesh. So that's the whole point, is keep your viewport light by choosing a lower number here. And then when you actually go to render, it's going to render at this higher subdivision amount. So now you can see this is rendering nice and smooth because it's using that subdivision renderer number. But typically what I like to do is keep this fairly similar, because at the end of the day, this fish is going to be fairly small. So something like that. So this looks fairly smooth. If I get out of my garage shading with lines and just get back to garage shading without lines, you can see that this looks, pretty smooth from a distance. So it's always relative. If we're really close, you would definitely see those subdivisions. So always something to keep in mind. So let's go ahead, and before we add eyes or anything else, let's go and rename our object. So this is fish, and this is fish SDS. And let's go and add a sphere, and this will be iris. And let's go to our 4-up view. Let's just move this in place, shrink this down, and let's go to this sphere, go to the coordinate tab, and let's just shrink this in the Z there. And let's just kind of move this into place, maybe rotate that a little bit. And I like my characters to have big eyeballs, so I'm going to make this fairly big. And then I'm just going to command click and drag to duplicate this. This will be the pupil. And I'm just going to move this out in the Z, scale this down, and there's our giant pupil. Now, one thing I like to do is I'm just going to make this pupil a child of this iris, so now we can move both of these around, and I can even scale this down in the Z even more to make this skinnier. Another thing I can do is you can see that both of these spheres are rather chunky in our viewport, so I can go to the object tab and just adjust the segments here just to smooth that out a little bit. And again, we're going to be shrinking this fish down so we can deal with a little bit of chunkiness, because we're not going to see this when the object's scaled down quite a bit. And let's go ahead, let's add the other eye to the other side. So for that, let's go ahead and get a symmetry object, and we've used these before. So you can see that the symmetry is mirroring the ZY plane. And we actually, if we need to think about this, we need to mirror in the YX plane. So we need to mirror on that plane. So if I choose XY, you can see that there is our eyes mirrored on that YX plane. Okay, so that's looking good. We got our eyes going on. Let's rename this though to eye symmetry. And now let's go ahead and let's add the mouth. And for the mouth, I'm just going to be super simple with this. Let's grab a torus and let's change the orientation to +X. And let's just kind of shrink this down. And there we got let's call this a big mouth fish. Why not? And, maybe it's very talkative, talks to our crab character a lot. And what we can do now is, adjust the radius here if we want to do that. However thick you want your fishy lips to be. And there we go. We basically have our fish all ready to go. And once you're happy with it, we can go ahead and let's just group all these objects together. So I'm going to click and drag to create a rectangle selection. Let's also go into our object tab so we're not accidentally selecting any polygons or anything like that. And let's go and group these objects together. So Command or Alt G, and let's rename this null with all these objects under it. And now what we can do is let's copy this object and paste it into our original project. So Controller Command C. Let's tab on over into our main scene, Command or Control V, and you can see we have a very giant fish. Let's scale this down a little bit and maybe place it off to the side, just like we did with our rocks and all those elements before we went and placed them inside of our fishbowl. So there you have it. We have a nice little fishy friend for our crab character. And we did it all with some very basic box modeling methods. Now, one thing I will tell you is that modeling is one of the hardest 3D disciplines to learn, and we really just scratched the surface of what's possible. But it's important to know about those basic modeling tools to have the ability to create, a simple model like this fish.